I'll just jump right in because try to keep to the time. My title is Redeeming Work on Techne, which is the Greek word for art, skill, craft, so at the root of work, on Techne as an encounter between God, man, and the world. So just to summarize the original introduction I had, just put it in just a word to get right into the thick of things. Ratzinger, very surprisingly, a couple years after the council, in his commentary, wrote that the fundamental question of the Constitution, Gaudium et Spes, was the question of work. It's very strange for him to say that, and he didn't explain what he meant. But I think if we think about it, work is something that's essentially human. It's part of the vocation that was built into human nature, as it were, as God created man with the commandment to marriage and family on the one hand and work on the other. And if the Gaudium et Spes is about the encounter with the world, work is, in a certain sense, a special place where man encounters the world. And then if the Gaudium et Spes is about specifically the problem of the modern world, it seems to me that work is a place where the impact of modernity, in some ways, most immediately and directly seen. Comes to very particular expression, and I want to begin here with that point about the modern transformation of the meaning of work. So let's begin our reflection here. One of the characteristic features of modernity is the tendency to reduce matters to their practical implications, to judge ultimately by utilitarian criteria. The ethos of modernity leads us in our consideration of a theme to ask not what something is, but instead what we can do with it, to ask after strategies and tactics rather than seeking a deeper understanding. So if this is true, one might say that we tend to pose the question of work in the modern world primarily from a modern perspective. Instead of asking most fundamentally about the meaning of work, we typically concern ourselves more with questions about its practice, its conditions, its distribution or availability, its proper organization and regulation, and so forth. Those on the left put particular weight on what are conceived as social justice issues, namely the problem of worker exploitation, poverty and unemployment, and perhaps at a deeper level, structural questions concerning the organization of economic systems. On the right, there's a desire to understand work as a special place to learn and exercise virtue, an emphasis on work as a means to make a contribution to society. Both sides give a special priority to the justice of wages, whether that be in the name of equality on the one hand or with a view to the proper integration of work into the healthy life of a family on the other. Both sides, though perhaps on somewhat different grounds, would emphasize the opportunities for charity that work represents. Now, it should be clear that all of these aspects are important and require careful thought. All of them, moreover, have received significant treatment in the tradition of Catholic social teaching and make an appearance in Gaudium et Spes. On the other hand, however, it is crucial to see that none of the things that I've mentioned concern the meaning of work in itself. The reason this is important comes to light in a special way when we return to the point I mentioned in my summary there. If work is a fundamental human reality, if it represents the proper place of man's engagement with the world, then to think of the question of work exclusively in terms of the issues mentioned, so the primarily ethical problems of social justice and virtue and so forth, is to reduce Christ's work of redemption, by implication, ultimately to a moral message. To think, in other words, that the issue of work holds interest for the Church only to the extent that it touches on some moral question is implicitly to concede that the grace of redemption, the communication of which is the Church's raison d'etre, does not reach to the inner reality of man in the world, that it does not penetrate to the core of human existence in the world, but remains instead a kind of overlay of subjective intentionality and so forth. Indeed, insofar as work is a kind of symbol of human praxis, of man's life specifically in the world, then to concede the superficiality with respect to work is to concede it in principle with respect to all other human activities, cultural institutions, and values. It is, in other words, to take for granted an essential divide between the religious life of the Church and the secular logic of the world in itself. which is what gave rise to the crisis to which the Second Vatican Council was first convened to address. This divide implies a competition between worldly autonomy and a Christian, that is, ecclesial or sacramental form, which makes all of the problems of the Church's relation to the modern world essentially insoluble. So all of this is, I think, at stake in the question of work, and when we start thinking in those terms, we see the justice of Ratzinger's remark. Whatever it is he himself meant, I don't know. Must have something to do with this. But so what does it mean to ask the question of the meaning of work in itself? It means, first of all, that we recognize that work has a meaning in itself, that there is an intelligible essence of work that expresses itself in the various activities that go by the name. It is by virtue of such an essence that we may think of work as a reality, an essential expression of human existence, a way of being in the world which has significance already in itself, in relative abstraction from questions of productivity, justice of wages, working conditions, and so forth. It's only by recognizing this intrinsic meaning of work, in fact, that we're able to affirm work as a place of encounter between man and the world, and indeed, therefore, between man and God, because it is only thus that we can affirm work as a fundamental expression of man's imaging of God in the charge he was given to have dominion over all things. God, after all, did not issue the command to work because he needed somebody to clean up the garden, and he was otherwise occupied. If God commanded man to work, we have to understand that was a gift he was giving to man, the capacity to share in his creation of the world, which means that work is, first of all, not a function of extrinsic need or utility, but first of all, work is a gift. I wish to propose in the following paper, first, that according to its inner logic and original essence, work has the form of an encounter between man and the world that opens up naturally to God. So that's the first thesis that I want to present. And second, that the dominant modern sense of work represents an elimination of just this encounter in natural movement in work, so that the Church's engagement with the world requires a recovery of the pre-modern notion of work, which presents a symbol of her engagement then with the world more generally. So I hope that's clear. That's the argument I want to make. And to do that, I'm going to first discuss some points proposed in a very interesting philosophy of work by Matthew Crawford, Shop Class is Soulcraft. And then I'm going to touch on some reflections from Plato on the meaning of techne, and then draw sort of a general insight from that, I hope. So, to begin, Matthew Crawford, no relation, I think, right? Crawford's book is essentially a plea on behalf of the value, that is, the goodness and beauty of manual labor in a world that has tended to privilege white-collar professions. Crawford himself began his adult professional life working in a public policy think tank after receiving a PhD from the University of Chicago, until the emptiness of that work, he said, drove him to return to his first love, motorcycles. So he now runs a garage in Virginia. His argument is, when he's not on the lecture circuit, his argument is that the various revolutions that have occurred in the sphere of work in the modern era, the Industrial Revolution, the revolution of the modern economy, the Taylorist Revolution, so mass production, and the many renewals of the Technological Revolution, these have all resulted in a growing separation between thinking and doing in the way that work is organized. So human intelligence, the thinking, has increasingly come to bear on work primarily in the form of engineering, planning, management, marketing, sales, advertising, and perhaps at the limit, customer service, though that's a stretch of the word intelligence, I think. What we have in this case is intelligence directed not in any actual way to some real thing produced, some tangible good, but rather principally to the various means of production and distribution. As a discrete object of human activity, the means in this case acquire a kind of entitative status in themselves, involving increasingly sophisticated and institutionalized relations that are required to justify their own existence as much as they are to facilitate the production of some real good outside of themselves. So this is the well-known phenomenon of bureaucracy. The abstraction of the means gives rise to a system of activities that run parallel to the actual work of production without intrinsic involvement in it. You can think of the comic presentations of this, The Office, the comic strip Dilbert. Lots of things go on, but there's never any reference to anything being made or produced, except things like PowerPoint presentations. And so in short, the thinkers are not themselves in any real sense doers. They are not involved in an intrinsically human way in the hands-on making of good things. On the flip side, by virtue of the separation of means and ends, the human agency of the doers is compromised also in a fundamental way. On the one hand, there's essentially no need for those in production to understand what they are doing because management has taken care of that. The worker does not work with a conception of the whole of the reality he is meant to produce. While it has been recognized, to be sure, that some general sense of what goes on in other departments can foster a sense of cooperation and being on a team, and thus increase productivity, in reality, efficiency is impaired the broader one's attention and sense of responsibility stretches. So the ideal is to have absolute focus and absolute responsibility for one part of the process, separated out from all the rest. But this separation inevitably entails an increasing impoverishment of the content of one's work. As Hegel observed already in the early 19th century, such work is, as it were, designed to be replaced by machines, because it has itself become little more than an inevitably humanly imperfect imitation of mechanical activity. So it's crucial to see that even if such individuals, in fact, never lose their job at the factory, they are nevertheless already at the deepest level unemployed, because they have ceased to be workers in the genuine sense of the term. Authors and originating sources of a work. Ergon, it's also a word for a deed accomplished. That is, some relatively complete thing recognized as good. Their role in the economy is not that of a producer, a maker. Instead, they become effectively merchants like everyone else, though what they sell is not any particular thing, but only their labor. And in this transformed sense, as a commodity, work ceases to be recognized as an activity that possesses actual content, which is an expression of my person and a real relationship that I have with some actual thing in the world. Instead, it has become abstract power, a certain quantity of time and energy, which can be indifferently applied to anything at all. In this respect, even though doing is opposed to thinking, as the reification of mere means that we see in bureaucratized management. In another respect, it comes to follow a similar pattern. It tends to be increasingly separated from content and reified as a mere means in itself. In this case, it becomes manpower. So I'd like to call the phenomenon that I've described here, taken in its entirety, the technologizing of work. And then to suggest that this captures the specifically modern form that work has come to represent. This is not a word that Crawford uses. In fact, he purposefully avoids using it, and I'd have to justify it in another context. But what I mean basically by technology here is a separation of means from ends, and then a rationalizing or organizing of the means in themselves in abstraction from any end for the sake of greater efficiency or productivity. To technologize work is to think of it not as some concrete activity, carpentry, sailing, practicing medicine, but above all as optimizable productive power. I will contrast technology with ancient Techne on this score in just a moment. But before that, I want to make a final observation about the technologization of work, to point to an implication, then to show what Crawford proposes in response. We might say that the technologizing of work represents a division of labor in the most radical sense, not only breaking apart of work activities as we normally think of it into their smallest and most manageable components, but at the very same time and at a deeper level, a division that cuts through every instance of work itself. Every instance of labor. As technologized, work no longer represents a concentrated engagement of the whole man, body and soul, in a fruit-bearing activity that immerses him in the world, but is now a labor that sets him on the world, and in separating thinking from doing, in a certain sense, separates his soul from his body, which is, incidentally, the classical definition of death. It is a division of labor from human meaning, because it is a division of labor from what is objectively meaningful. One of the more profound and far-reaching consequences of this radical division of labor is the cutting loose of the economy from its roots in nature, which would provide organic limits and keep the production, exchange, and consumption of goods anchored in local communities. As Crawford points out, for his part, the more the component parts of work are separated out from each other, the more what would otherwise be natural realities and human activities turn into commodities, the value of which necessarily, by its own inner logic, gets determined by the market, and specifically, necessarily by the global market. And the market has to be global because once it's detached from a context, there's nothing outside of it that can measure it. It by its very nature, has to encompass the globe. There will thus be an inherent tendency for the law of optimization to require the outsourcing of the different components of work and the mobilization of the workforce. The further the process of technologization develops, the greater and more substantial becomes the machinery, both literal and metaphorical, that is interposed between man and the world. So instead of mediating an encounter between man and the world, which transforms both in different ways, work becomes an imposition in both directions. The medium becomes opaque, and man loses the basic reference point in nature by which he can orient himself and so bear the genuine fruit of culture. In this case, the provision of work to otherwise destitute regions of the world represents a mitigation of poverty only in the crudest sense of the term. At a deeper level, in relation to the quality of human existence, outsourcing is actually an exportation of poverty. Crawford responds to this crisis by extolling the virtues of manual labor, the ability to make or fix things with one's hands, which he says is the sort of work that will never go offshore for obvious reasons. The virtues he illuminates in such work all stem from a fairly straightforward observation that in doing this work, one is confronted in a direct way with a reality that presents its own criteria for that engagement, its own standards of completion and fittingness. I don't decide when my faucet has stopped leaking. It decides, and its coming to this decision demands my fully attentive and obedient cooperation. The objective reality, the intrinsic nature of the thing, calls me out of myself in my interaction with it and requires the subordination of my will. If we understand this properly and pay attention to our experience of it, we discover that this subordination is not an affront to our freedom, but rather a deepening of it and a granting of genuine substance to our agency. As Crawford says, to be masters of our stuff requires that we first allow ourselves to be mastered by it. So what does this mean? It means, I believe, that our will becomes more genuinely free the more its power is drawn from the reality of the world in which it is involved, rather than artificially multiplied through the separation from the world that technology constantly invents new ways to facilitate. As real capacity, human agency acquires a nuanced and textured shape, a breadth and depth, a maturity and intrinsic wisdom, through which man extends himself into the world, and the world extends itself into man. This extension entails an essentially receptive moment, which entails a kind of trusting consent to something that is, at least in some respect, greater than my will. The respect in which it is greater is that it, the reality I seek to master, sets the terms, as I said, most directly. It provides the determination, the form, to which my will must conform. And once it does, once here means not the flash of a single moment, but the fruit of a long and patient labor in which a real natural development occurs, then I find my agency more capacious than it was before. The previously opaque reality that once stood before me as foreign is now relatively transparent, in a sense, but not because it is finally yielded, defenseless to the force of my willpower. Instead, it has become, in a certain sense, internal to my will, in all of its substantial reality. Now, Crawford's reflections on the reality of work, profound as they are not altogether new. In fact, his contrast between genuine manual labor and the perversion of work we have just described echoes in remarkable ways an ancient dispute, namely that between philosophy and sophistry, as depicted by Plato. In the context of this dispute, Plato reflects on the proper meaning of techne, art, skill, or craft, as I said, or in other words, the practical wisdom that's ordered to making. Techne, which represents, we might say, the essence of work. It is worthwhile recalling the basic features of Plato's notion of techne in relation to our present discussion for three reasons. First, it helps to clarify what we might call the essential difference between ancient techne and modern technology, which in turn illuminates further the impact of modernity on the meaning of work, which we've been exploring here. Second, connecting Crawford to Plato gives a metaphysical weight to Crawford's more directly cultural and anthropological reflections, and roots those reflections more deeply in the philosophical tradition. And third, connecting Plato, conversely, to Crawford, shows in turn that the contrast between an ancient and a modern concept of work is not a crudely chronological matter. So it's not old is good, new is bad, but concerns a difference in the mode of being. Above all, so a mode of being above all, and therefore is relevant to any historical period. Okay. So I'm going to do this very briefly here. The principal context in which Plato discusses the meaning of techne, I said, is his debate with the sophists, the itinerant teachers who sold their lessons and who invariably found eager buyers, insofar as their lessons consisted of instruction in skills and techniques, that word again, through the use of which one could become successful, understood, of course, in terms of wealth or political power. Sophistry represented for Plato something like a technologizing of human communication in the sense of the terms we have proposed. It's the rationalizing of means, and we heard about this on my father's lecture the first night. In this case, though, persuasive speech and the art of argumentation, which have been abstracted from any real relation to any end or any particular content, and then an interpretation of these means as entirely practical. The simple production of results in a manner that leaves the theoretical or substantial content of those results up to the agent in any particular case. The novelty of sophistry lay in the fact that it made efficiency a principal goal, and it was attractive because of its discovery of the power of purifying means, both in the sense of rationalizing them, excising inefficiencies so that they can be harnessed or controlled, and also in the sense of cleansing them of content and so rendering them neutral. In a word, sophistry represented in a decisive and symbolic way the absolutizing of instrumentality. Now, it seems to me there's a clear analogy between the sophistical notion of rhetoric and the modern notion of work. Work in the modern sense, a mere instrument, the value of which depends on what it produces, whether that be in the obvious sense of the quantity of change effected in the world, the things produced and the profit generated, or in the more subtle sense of the virtue acquired, the good things accomplished, the support of one's family, the contribution to society, the glory rendered to God, and so forth. Plato's critique of sophistry, insofar as it illuminates the meaning of techne, which lies at the heart of work, may thus be taken as a critique of the modern concept of work, or that's what I want to propose. So the modern concept of work is sophistical work. I can here, just in this context, just make three basic points in Plato's conception of techne, but I think it'll be evident how it resonates with the general drift of argument here. First, Plato explains in the Republic that a techne, any techne, is by its inner logic ordered to the good of that upon which it is set, or to which it is directed, rather than the good of the practitioner, the good of the art itself, or any other external purposes. None of these purposes is excluded in principle, but understood correctly, they prove to be secondary fruits resulting from the pursuit of the proper good. So, for example, the art of medicine is directed not to itself, but to the body. Or in other words, it does not heal medicine, but through the use of medicine heals human beings. It seems like a very simple point, but with Plato always, it's actually quite an extraordinary one. The techne here can be said to have an essentially self-transcending or other referential character. The achievement of its proper good, human health, may entail a host of further goods in a natural and spontaneous way. For example, the doctor may become rich. He may learn the true meaning of service or come to understand better the deep mystery of human suffering. He may make discoveries that improve the practice. He may make a contribution to the well-being of his community and so forth. But none of these is the proper purpose of the techne of medicine. And that techne becomes distorted when we forget this. It is a very simple point, but in fact the world would be a profoundly different place if this simple point were understood and acknowledged. Second, a techne is a kind of knowledge, Plato says, and so is rooted in the truth of its object. As Plato shows in the Gorgias, one cannot speak well about something unless one understands it. He makes this point in response to the sophists who think of language in a purely instrumentalist sense. For them, as we mentioned above, one can learn techniques of effective writing and speaking that can be applied subsequently to anything. If this is true, however, it means that language is not of its very essence a matter of truth. For Plato, by contrast, what a word is, by definition, is a medium through which the truth makes itself manifest. Analogous to this, he observes that every techne, by its very essence, is a matter of truth. Medicine is not ordered to merely feeling good, to the merely subjective conviction that one is healthy, to the effecting of an outward appearance of well-being. Instead, it is ordered to being healthy, to health in its truth. One cannot practice medicine unless one knows what health really is. Thus, for Plato, every techne is rooted in the truth of reality and ordered to its good. Or in other words, techne concerns the goodness of the truth of its particular matter and the truth of its goodness. At the outset, I referred to the need to recover a contemplative dimension of work. That dimension, it seems to me, arises precisely when we recognize techne's connection to the truth of things. Now, truth and goodness converge particularly in beauty. The third point I wish to indicate in Plato's conception of techne comes from the Phaedrus, a dialogue essentially about beauty, the love it engenders, and proper use of language in its regard. The specific point concerns the proper, that I want to make here, concerns the proper scope of the knowledge entailed in techne. There is in this, I believe, a deep connection with the theme of beauty, though there is no room here to bring it to light. But be that as it may, the Phaedrus at one point picks up the thread from the discussion in the Gorgias we just discussed and carries it a step further, a step into the very theme we began with here. To paraphrase the discussion, Socrates affirms the claim we just made, namely that techne presupposes knowledge of the truth of its object, but then he asks further, what in fact do we need to know in order to know the truth of a thing? To specify the question, he takes, once again, the medical art as an example. What do we need to know, in fact, to know the truth of human health? Though he does not explain his answer to this question, in fact, rather than offer an argument, he appeals to the authority of Hippocrates, the father of medicine. It's not too difficult, I think, to adduce reasons. In order to know the truth of health, he says we need to know the nature of the cosmos as a whole. Drawing on Plato's discussions elsewhere, we might add, to know this, we have to know the nature of the first cause of the cosmos, the nature of God himself. Now, it seems to me that what Plato says here perhaps stands out in an especially vivid way in the example of medicine, and that comes to light especially when we consider the state of things today. But I want to suggest that something analogous might be said about every techne, every kind of work, insofar as it's genuine. Every techne that's a real techne, which means ordered to the goodness of the truth of the goodness, or in a word, the genuine beauty of its particular reality. So let us consider, for example, the techne of house building, another classic one. And imagine someone who comes to this work out of a genuine love of houses. So what does he have to know to build a proper house? What sort of questions would naturally enter into his field of interest? For one, they're the questions of materials. What's quality in this case? Why is plaster and brick better than wallboard? What's the best wood? Where does it come from? What is the source of this wood? How did the trees grow? What's the climate, the history of the region? What's the history of the company that harvested and cut the timber? On another level, he would have to know what a house is for. What constitutes human flourishing, and how does the layout, the design, and shape of the rooms and their relation to each other and to the whole contribute to this flourishing? The prominence of hospitality, for example, would yield a very different design compared to the privileging of storage. And then there is the great question of style. What is the relation between usefulness and beauty? What is beauty? What is the evolution of styles throughout history? And how do different styles reflect different worldviews, different convictions about the meaning of life, different understandings of the nature of God? what I want to point out in this example is that the particular reality of that on which one works, a house in this case, opens up beyond itself, ultimately to the whole world and to God, if it is affirmed through a genuine love. And this is because love is connected to beauty, the goodness of the truth, and the truth of the goodness of a thing. It seems to me we have a rather obvious analogy here with a good love relationship. Rather than read this, just the particularity of the relationship, if it's healthy, spontaneously opens you up to other people. It's got an inner openness to make room for others. And it also, the more deeply you're involved, if it's a good relationship, you become more interested in other aspects of your life and closer with your family and so forth. A bad relationship, the exact opposite happens, right? You become distracted from things in the world. But I want to say good work opens, if it's healthy, it opens the whole world up to you. Right. If we look at Crawford, we see that this work on motorcycles, which is quite evidently for him a labor of love, even when it's an extremely precise and narrowly focused occupation, it can connect you with a broader community. And I've got a long passage that I won't read where he describes that. He's not thinking about Plato or any of this, but it happens quite spontaneously. But I think we can go a step further beyond Crawford, pointing out that anytime there's an encounter with the world and its basic meaning, and an intrinsic encounter with other human beings, a creation of community. Anytime the question of the meaning of life comes to bear, there is in fact, and however unconscious it may be, an encounter with God, the source and absolute exemplar of all goodness, truth, and beauty, and indeed of the love in which these are received, affirmed, and cultivated. So to conclude, let's turn back to the question of the role of work in Gaudium et Spes. As I observed, the document is concerned with the Church's encounter with the modern world, and Ratzinger pointed to work as the fundamental question of the Constitution, which suggests, as I said, that it represents a privileged place of this encounter, and that the form it takes bears on the meaning of both the Church and the world. While one might interpret this emphasis on work as an elevation of the various questions of social justice in the conventional understanding of the term, and so a relativizing of properly theological themes, our reflection on the meaning of work in itself suggests a different way to understand it. If work is a matter of the intrinsic goodness, truth, and beauty of the world as created, and if the transformative activity of work, engaged in as a techne rather than as a technology, opens that world up beyond itself to the meaning of human existence and ultimately to God's own purposes, then work brings into contact the inner essence of the Church and the inner essence of the world. To echo the title of a famous book, it reveals that one does not need to abandon the center of the Church in order to enter into the heart of the world. Recognizing this casts a new light on some of the old questions of the nature of the autonomy of the secular world, the relation between nature and grace, and so forth. But in any event, it should not surprise us, after all, that the question of work should figure so centrally in the anthropological and Christocentric refocusing of the mind of the Church in the Vatican II documents. Since along with the primordial sacrament of marriage, work is the original task God gave to man at the very origin, to be fruitful thus both inside the human relation of the family and out beyond the family in the world, and through man's cultivation to enable the world to open up from its own innermost core to God, just as it flourishes in the goodness of its own truth. We thus come to understand why, when Christ took on the human condition in his act of redemption, which both restored creation to its original integrity and elevated it infinitely beyond itself to share in the intimate exchange of Trinitarian love, he not only performed the great work of his sacrificial death for us, but for long years and in a quiet, hidden way first lived alongside us and, we might say, did our work with us. Quote from GS 22, he worked with human hands, he thought with a human mind, acted by human choice, and loved with a human heart.